في قاعة المعهد أولاً، ومن ثم من المشاركين من خلال زوم. نطلب من الجميع طرح أسئلتهم أو تعليقاتهم خلال أقل من دقيقتين لإتاحة الفرصة للمحاضر للإجابة عليها. نود أن نلفت انتباهكم بأنه يتوفر ترجمة فورية من خلال الندوة الرقمية لتسهيل التواصل. للمتواجدين معنا في القاعة يتوفر عدد محدود من أجهزة الترجمة الفورية. لمن يرغب بسماع المحاضرة باللغة العربية بالكامل بالإمكان التوجه إلى القاعة المجاورة. والآن لنبدأ المحاضرة بكلمة افتتاحية يلقيها مدير عام معهد ماس السيد رجل خالدي، فليتفضل مشكورا.
شكرا الزميلة رند طويل هذا التقديم. سيدات والسادة ضيوف الكرام، يسعدني أن أرحب بالضيوف الكرام الذين انضموا إلينا للاستماع إلى محاضرة اليوم التي يقدمها محاضر عالمي مرموق احتفالا بإرث مفكر عربي معاصر عظيم، لاجئ فلسطيني لم يتسنى له العودة أبدا إلى وطنه الذي كرس له معظم أعمال حياته، يوسف عبد الله الصايغ، التي سميت المحاضرة والسلسلة باسمه تكريما لمساهمته الرائدة في دراسات التنمية الفلسطينية. يتقدم المعهد بالخالص امتنانه للحضور الكريم المشارك معنا من فلسطين وفي فلسطين ومن العالم العربي وأوروبا وآسيا والأمريكيتين على اهتمامهم بالمشاركة في المحاضرة 12 ضمن هذه السلسلة، بما في ذلك المشاركين عبر الندوة الرقمية التي أتاحت لنا تنظيم مثل هذا الحدث العالمي. أنه لشرف عظيم لمعهد أبحاث السياسات الاقتصادية الفلسطيني ماس أن يستضيف العالم الاقتصادي البارز البرفسور جوزيف ستيجليتز، أستاذ الاقتصاد في جامعة كولومبيا. سيتحدث إلينا اليوم في بث حي ومباشر عن الاتجاهات الاقتصادية العالمية الجديدة التي نشهدها في عالم ما بعد كوفيد-19، وخاصة الحاجة إلى التعاون وسط التحول العالمي بعيدا عن النمو الاقتصادي القائم على التصنيع إلى اقتصاد الخدمات ومن الوقود الأحفوري لأنواع بديلة من الطاقة. إذا كان عصر النيوليبرالية قد شارف على الانتهاء كما يتكهن البرفسور، مخلفا ورائه عدم الاستقرار الاقتصادي والسياسي وعدم المساواة والاستقطاب، نقبل أن يشاركنا المحاضر بما يجب أن نتعلمه من الاستجابة العالمية لكوفيد في حقبة جديدة تتطلب التعاون أكثر من أي وقت مضى. قد يتساءل المشاركون: أين تقع فلسطين من هذه القضايا العالمية؟ وما هي صلة أفكار ستيجليتز بالوضع الفلسطيني؟ قد يعرف البعض منكم عن إسهاماته في نظرية عدم تماثل المعلومات والعديد من المفاهيم الاقتصادية الأخرى، إلا أن مناسبة اليوم ليست المرة الأولى التي يتحدث فيها المحاضر عن فلسطين، فأبان توليه منصب كبير الاقتصاديين في البنك الدولي في العام 1997 تعاون مع مدير عام معهد ماس في حينه الدكتور نبيل أسيس، وهو حاليا يشغل منصب رئيس مجلس أمنائنا، في تنفيذ مشروع بحثي مشترك بين المؤسستين بعنوان التنمية رغم الصعاب، الاقتصاد الفلسطيني في مرحلة انتقالية، والتي تعد بالتالي محفزا لعنوان محاضرة اليوم ومنطلق لهذه المحاضرة. من وجهة نظرنا في فلسطين بعد 25 عاما أصبح للصعاب معنى جديد كليا، فلا تزال التنمية سرابا، وأصبحت المرحلة الانتقالية لتحقيق السلام والاستقلال حالة ممتدة لوضع راهن يعيشه الشعب الفلسطيني منذ ذاك. مهما كان الوضع السياسي الفلسطيني فريدا، إلا أن المأزق الاقتصادي الفلسطيني ليس من صنع ذاته. نرى الصعوبات الاجتماعية والاقتصادية حول العالم بأشكالها المتعددة، بينما تتعثر التنمية وفعالية المنظومة الاقتصادية متعددة الأطراف العالمية إن لم تكن في تراجع مستمر. لهذا ندرك أننا أيضا جزء من هذا الاقتصاد العالمي المعولم. بالطبع لن أتحدث نيابة عن المحاضر، كمشاركين سيكون لكم طبعا منكم استنتاجاته لكل منكم الخاصة حول ما تضيفه أفكاره. لكن بالنسبة لي شخصيا أشعر أن العصر الجديد للاقتصاد العالمي الذي بدأ يظهر خلال العقد الماضي سيتطلب ثورة في الطريقة التي ينظر بها الاقتصاديون وصانعو السياسات والمواطنون في جميع أنحاء العالم إلى توجيه التنمية الاقتصادية وإلى الحاجة إلى التعاون العالمي. على الفلسطينيين كذلك أن يكونوا مستعدين لمواجهة هذا التحول الفكري حتى يكونوا سباقين في التنمية الاقتصادية وفي المفاوضات من أجلها، بدلا من مجرد الاكتفاء بمراقبة ما يجري وإطلاق ردود الفعل. لذلك أحببت خلال ترحيبي بضيوفنا وبمحاضرنا المرموق أن أذكر أننا في فلسطين على الرغم من عزلتنا والاحتلال إلا أننا لسنا بعيدين عن آخر الأفكار والسياسات الاقتصادية الدولية بغض النظر عن اتجاهاتها وكيف تنعكس علينا. ما يعيدني إلى إرث الدكتور صايغ الذي عاصر مراحل نضوج الفكر الاقتصادي الفلسطيني على اختلافها. فقد تناول صايغ مفاهيم ونظريات التنمية الكلاسيكية في البرنامج العام لإنماء الاقتصاد الوطني الفلسطيني الذي تبنته منظمة التحرير في العام 93 قبل جذب السلطة الوطنية الفلسطينية الناشئة إلى فلك سياسات إجماع واشنطن بوعود التحرر الاقتصادي من خلال إبرام اتفاقيات أوسلو وباريس الاقتصادية بالذات. على مدى ربع القرن الماضي ملأت هذه العقيدة الفراغ في السياسة الاقتصادية الذي نتج عن غياب أفكار صايغة عن المشهد، وليس هناك اقتصادي أفضل من البرفسور ستيجليتز نفسه ليعلمنا اليوم ما قد يحل محل هذه العقيدة في السنوات القادمة. تتيح لنا محاضرة اليوم بمشاركة مثقفين من كافة أنحاء العالم وفلسطين فرصة لإحياء الإرث الاقتصادي التحرري ليوسف صايغ، والذي يلخصه أفضل ما يكون بيانه الاشتراكي العربي الخبز مع الكرامة المتاح اليوم بين أيديكم هنا في القاعة. كما أنها فرصة لنذكر العالم بأننا نبث من هنا وطننا فلسطين رغم الاحتلال والقمع، وأننا نبني اقتصادا وطنيا رغم الحصار وسلب أراضينا، ونعمل على صياغة عقيدتنا السياسية الاقتصادية الخاصة كما فعل صايغ حول كيفية بناء اقتصاد فلسطيني منتج ومعتمد على ذاته وعادل. أخيرا أتقدم بالشكر من صندوق الاستثمار الفلسطيني على رعايته لمحاضرة هذا العام، وأشكر بشكل خاص البرفسور ستيجليتز على تخصيصه بعض الوقت من جدوله الحافل للتحضير للمحاضرة وللتواجد معنا اليوم، علما بأنه سيتاح لبعض المتواجدين معنا بعد اللقاء محاضرته فرصة محدودة لتبادل الآراء والأسئلة. Professor Stieglitz, welcome to Palestine, even if virtually. The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this invitation to give this distinguished lecture in memory of what I want to begin with is the remark that was just made that it's been 24 years since I last visited Palestine. In 1997, when I was chief economist of the World Bank, the director general of MAS and I introduced the joint research product of their institutions that was just referred to, called Development Under Adversity, the Palestinian Economy in Transition. At that still hopeful historical juncture, both for Palestine and the global economy, The emphasis of such efforts was influenced by the prevailing economic orthodoxy of the time, but one which even at that time was beginning to be questioned. For instance, in the following January at WIDER, the UN World Institute for Development Economics in Helsinki, I provided a critique of the Washington Consensus, the set of policy recommendations that were based on the conventional wisdom of the IMF, the World Bank, the US Treasury. I talked about there being more instruments and broader objectives than were embraced by the Washington Consensus. The technical aspects of the Palestinian Development Challenge were the focus of the policy advice of that report. And while the structural threat to the economy of Israeli, resulting from the Israeli occupation was relegated to a post-interim period phase. Of course, nobody has a crystal ball, and who could have thought it would last as long as it has? As the World Bank Forward stated, taken together and given the right environment and an effective development strategy, the Palestinian economy could generate substantial growth rates in the near future. Some of the most important elements of the development strategy identified in the book are opening up markets abroad through new trade channels and diversifying away from a disproportionate reliance on Israel in trade and delivery of services, creating a governing system with an efficient civil service, an investment-oriented public expenditure program, and suitable tools for stabilizing the economy and taking advantage of the dynamic civil society and the resourceful non-governmental organizations in the delivery of health, education, welfare, infrastructure services. During my visit to the West Bank and Gaza, at the launch of that research program, however, I had also become disillusioned. I saw the hardship, much of it unnecessary, the obstacles to development that the Israeli authorities were imposing on the development of Palestine. 25 years later, adversity has taken on a whole new meaning for Palestine. Development remains a mirage, and an unending transition to peace and independence has become the status quo for the Palestinian people. However unique the Palestinians' political situation may be, its economic predicament is not of its own making. Social and economic adversity has taken many forms around the world, while development and multilateralism appear stalled, if not in regression. In the few minutes I have today, I want to set the particular challenges facing Palestine in a more global context. There have been striking changes in the global landscape of economic structure, power, and ideology over the past quarter century. As hard as development under adversity has been during the past decades, it is likely to be even more difficult going forward. Economics is sometimes called the dismal science, and unfortunately, we are facing a very difficult period. There are three interrelated themes that I want to develop. The first focuses on two major structural changes in the global economy, both of which have major impacts on Palestine and the region. The second focuses on geopolitics. There is a new Cold War brewing, and it's uncertain how this will affect Palestine and the region, but it will cast its dark shadow almost surely everywhere. And the third is on changes in intellectual currents. The Washington Consensus is dead. The underlying neoliberal ideology has lost its dominant position, but what will replace it? I thought it might be useful if I prepared some slides. So let me share the screen. It says, can I share the screen, or is that a problem?
Yes, yeah, right now we'll be giving it that. Sorry, that could have been.
So, as I said, these are the three major challenges I'm going to be talking about: the change in the global economic landscape, in geopolitics, and in ideologies and ways of thinking. There are four key changes in the economic structure. The first was alluded to in the introduction, the move from manufacturing to a service sector economy. This is global. The second is robotization and other advances in technology. The third, which will have particular implications for the Middle East, is the green transition. And finally, the fourth is the move away from globalization. So what I want to do now is to talk about some of the implications of these four major trends for developing countries and for countries like Palestine. The first is that manufacturing export-led growth, which was the key to the successful development in the most successful region of the world in development, which was East Asia, the manufacturing export-led growth model won't play the role that it did. The reason for this is that global employment in manufacturing is declining, and the advantages of cheap labor are decreasing. And so there won't be the ability to create manufacturing jobs, which have been the basis of the successful development strategy. There will be, as a result, a need to look for other models. Those other models will have to use a portfolio of strategies rather than the single strategy that was so successful in East Asia, the manufacturing export-led growth. It will have to find ways of providing employment, foreign exchange, learning. Knowledge is at the core of successful development. Manufacturing provided a way of connecting developing countries with more advanced countries, and created a kind of learning process that was essential. All these things will have to be done, but it will have to be done through a portfolio of strategies involving many sectors of the economy, service sector, agriculture, and some limited role that manufacturing will continue to play. The underlying point, though, is that it won't be as simple as simply imitating what was successful in the past. The green transition is going to have very strong implications for resource-dependent developing countries. It's very high likelihood, I would say almost a certainty, that the demand for fossil fuels will decline enormously. And with that decline in demand, so will the price of fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. This is the obvious implication of net carbon neutrality. An increasingly large number of countries have committed themselves to this net carbon neutrality. The United States, Europe, a large fraction of a private sector have committed themselves to that. And so what that means is that they will be committed to reducing dramatically their consumption of oil and gas. Part of the consequence of that, in turn, is that they are going to be huge investments in research and development for renewables. And the advances in technology that result from those research expenditures will make fossil fuels less competitive. So either way you look at it, the price of fossil fuels will decline. This is going to have, obviously, some very big implications for the Middle East and other oil and gas dependent countries. It means it's important for them to create an alternative model. Some countries are beginning to do that, but it will happen. It will have to happen much faster than has been the case so far. And it will have to happen in ways that generate not only the foreign exchange, but also jobs. If that doesn't happen, there are big questions about what will be the political consequences domestically. The Middle East, of course, has been endowed with abundant sunlight, which means that the energy potential is very large. And that means that the countries that don't have oil but have sunlight will gain relative to others. So while it is going to be a very big challenge to those countries that have made are totally dependent on fossil fuels, it may actually bring some advantage to those without fossil fuels, but with an abundance of sunlight. I want to emphasize the critical role of education. One of the big advantages of the new technologies, which is emerging, is that location matters much less than it used to. One can be part of the global supply chain on the internet for many of the important services. And so some countries that previously seemed very isolated have actually been able to sell technology services all over the world. There's a second important role for education, and that is to keep competitive. Rapid changes in technology require high levels of adaptability. And adaptability requires an educated labor force. So that one can think about what has been going on is that the advances in technology that I referred to earlier, the robotization and other advances in technology have decreased the value of unskilled labor, but they've been biased towards increasing the value of education and skilled labor. And that means if one wants to have remain competitive and to have rising standards of living, there will have to be large investments in education. The final aspect of the change in the global economy that I want to highlight is the move away from globalization. I noted in the beginning of my remarks that at the time of my visit to Palestine in 1997, there was a lot of optimism about how trade will bring increases in standards of living and promote development. Trade is not delivered in many places in the world, lived up to its promise. And what is even more disturbing is that in the advanced countries, who are among the big beneficiaries of globalization, there is a turn away from globalization. This was obviously most evident during the last administration under Donald Trump. He talked about globalization was unfair to the United States. It was ironic because the United States had actually written most of the rules of globalization, and they were written not only by America, they were written to benefit America, but they were written to benefit corporate America, not America's working people, not America as a whole. And that is one of the sources of the anti-globalization movement. In my book, Globalization and Discontent, I raised that point very forcefully. In the midst of the Trump administration, I revisited the issue. I wrote a sequel called Globalization and Discontents Revisited. And what I highlighted there was that Trump's arguments against globalization were, for the most part, simply wrong. He was looking at the issue of globalization through the lens of a zero sum, where the gains in one part of the world came at the expense of the United States. Economists have always emphasized that there can be mutual benefit from trade. But if everybody on both sides is to gain from trade, there have to be the appropriate rules. And the rules that were embedded in globalization, embedded in the Washington Consensus, were often rules that worked for the corporations, but not for the rest of society. And I'll comment on one aspect of that that's become very clear during COVID-19 in a minute. But before coming to that, I want to note that while the move away from globalization was very evident during the Trump administration, the Biden administration has not reversed a number of the policies. For instance, there are still the WTO appellate judges that have been, the appointment of which have been blocked during the Trump administration. There's still not a full complement of WTO appellate judges, and without an appellate body, it's very hard to have a well-functioning global trade regime. The Biden administration has still largely kept the Trump tariffs in place. There is no discussion of new trade agreements. And there's actually very little discussion of globalization. COVID-19 and climate change have highlighted the importance of global cooperation. It was global cooperation in science that enabled the world to quickly develop a vaccine that has brought COVID-19 under control, at least in many countries around the world. The basic science was done in the UK and the United States and a number of other countries. The development of mRNA vaccines, the idea was done by a Hungarian working at the University of Pennsylvania. The new mRNA vaccine was brought to market by some Turkish workers working in a German factory. So the development of the vaccine really was a spectacular achievement of modern science and was a result of global cooperation in science. But unfortunately, COVID-19 also led the world to show the ugly side. There was vaccine nationalism. There is still opposition to the IPR waiver for COVID-19 intellectual property, vaccines and other COVID-19 intellectual property. The issue will be debated later this month in Geneva. And from what I've heard, not very optimistic, in spite of the fact that more than 100 countries are supporting it. remarkable because it's so clearly in the interest of all the countries of the world that everybody in the world receive the vaccine. As long as the disease continues to rage in parts of the world, there will be mutations. And some of these mutations will be more contagious, more deadly, or even possibly vaccine resistant. The economic and health consequences of the continuation of this disease are unimaginable. And what I find so disturbing is that if we can't get a global agreement on something that seems so simple, so much in the interest of the advanced countries, so much in the interest of Germany, France, and the other countries that seem to be standing in the way, how are we going to get global agreements on things that are so much more difficult? COVID-19 also had one other effect on globalization. It showed the lack of resilience in global supply chains. In the United States, we couldn't even get access. We weren't able to produce masks. Couldn't get access to masks, protective gear, producing tests, let alone complicated products like ventilators. And this lack of resilience is causing a rethinking of globalization and a rethinking of many of the tenets that underlay globalization. I'll come back to some of that a little later in this talk, but just to illustrate, one of the tenets of the Washington Consensus was a strong antipathy towards industrial policies, where governments took a lead in promoting certain sectors or certain technologies. But today, as we face in the United States and Europe severe problems with access to chips, in the United States, there's a broad consensus across parties, bipartisan Democrats and Republicans, that we need industrial policies. The market on its own is not supplying enough chips, and there needs to be further government support for the production of chips. And so that's just one example where the lack of resilience that was so evident during the pandemic is leading to a rethinking of globalization and rethinking a localization, at least in some cases, of production. Well, there are going to be mixed consequences of this move away from globalization. It will mean, in some ways, more scope for countries, developing countries, emerging markets to pursue their own policies. But unfortunately, less focus on the global economic agenda may mean less assistance and less interest in other countries. In some of the advanced countries, the huge increase in the debt that has occurred in the last couple of years will make countries feel more constrained in their spending. And those budget constraints will restrain assistance. In an earlier era, and I'll come to this a little bit more, where you had competition between China, Russia, and the United States, that competition resulted in more money for developing countries and emerging markets. China is actually providing enormous amount of money for investments and infrastructure, but it's shown itself to be what I might call a harsh lender. Those countries needing debt restructuring, it's been very reluctant to engage in that kind of debt restructuring. In the case of Sri Lanka, it took over the port as part of the collateral. And Russia is more engaged in the rest of the world, and it's been today than it was in the years following the collapse of the Iron Curtain. But Russia appears more interested in disruption than in promoting development. As I look at what is happening, particularly in Europe, but to some extent in the United States, fear of migration pressures is likely to be a stronger motivator than ideology or power battles for the provision of assistance. But it will be focused more on what can be done to prevent migration than on what can be done to raise standards of living in the emerging markets in developing countries. Let me now turn to the new geopolitics. The new geopolitics is likely to be dominated by the new Cold War between the United States and China, with other countries caught in the crosshairs, and Russia playing, as I've just noted, a generally disruptive role. There are multiple ingredients in this new Cold War. The rationale is markedly different under Biden than under Trump, but the practice may not be that different. As I noted earlier, tariffs are still in place. There are restrictions on investments. There's a broader sense of hostility. Some of it is based on concerns about security, cybersecurity, conflicts, particularly in Asia, for who will play a more important role. In the United States, a far more dominant role in the conflict under Biden than under Trump is concerned about democracy and human rights, concerns about what happened in Hong Kong with the Uyghurs. And that those very deep concerns will make it very difficult for there to be return to full normality. The challenge for the United States will be to figure out how to get cooperation in the areas that we need, like in health and climate change, and yet at the same time continue to articulate our differences of views about democracy and human rights. But an important element of the conflict between China and the United States is economic competition. I say that as an economist, but I can say it's clearly an important part of what is going on. When China began its development, when the U.S. began engagement with China under Nixon, almost 50 years ago now, it was inconceivable that China would be an economic threat. Per capita income in China was something like $150 a year. Now, China, in purchasing power parity, which is the way we economists compare the size of the economy, one economy with another, in those terms, China had already became the largest country in the world around 2015, and clearly by 2030 will be significantly larger than the United States. Many political scientists have talked about the Thucydides moment, the fact that the country that has gone from the dominant to the second never likes that. And that can give rise to conflict if it's not well managed. But going beyond that macroeconomic perspective, in some technology, China has become a strong competitor. In many areas, it is the dominant producer. We rely on China for our chips. A large proportion of solar panels that are going to be so important in addressing the problems of climate change. In many sectors around the economy, we've lost our ability to produce, and we rely very heavily on production in China. It's also clear that in many arenas, China has shown its ability to organize things more effectively than the US, as in infrastructure and high-speed trains. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has showed some of the advantages of the surveillance society. It's been better able to keep the disease under control at an enormous cost to democratic freedoms. So the issue of I think most Americans would not accept that kind of, most Europeans would not accept that kind of surveillance. But what the point I'm trying to emphasize is that in many arenas, it has shown itself to be a strong economic competitor. While it has succeeded in actually being at the frontier in some areas of innovation, like AI, which are very data intensive, I don't believe it's likely to be a real source of technological competition over the long run. And that's simply because I don't believe that one can be innovative in an environment where one doesn't have more openness, more democratic voice, more engagement with the rest of the world. One of the reasons I've been so concerned with the kind of mentality that Donald Trump exhibited was that it was closing off America from the rest of the world. It was anti-intellectual, an irony, because what made America strong was our technology based on our research universities, which were based on education and openness. So what I want to emphasize is that while there is economic competition going on, the framework of that economic competition is markedly different from that of Trump. It's not the zero-sum reasoning that I referred to earlier, not based on China's taking advantage of us, but rather it's based on concerns of democracy, human rights, and just old-fashioned competition. And as I mentioned earlier, we have recognized the need for cooperation, global warming, and health. But the consequence of this economic competition has been to push U.S. to become less dependent on China, less enthusiastic about globalization, and to adopt industrial policy, which are an example of a major change in ideology going on today. And that brings me to the third and final topic that I want to talk about, the battle over ideas. It's a battle that's going on both within countries and between countries, within the West and between democracies and authoritarian regimes. In some ways, it's a much more nuanced and complicated than the battles of the previous 2 centuries. But in other ways, it's actually less nuanced. It's a mix of economic issues like self-interest, with cultural issues. For instance, if we go back to the battle of ideas over the last 40 years, the ideas that sometimes referred to neoliberalism, market fundamentalism, free market ideology, that gained currency under Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the UK. The interesting thing is that those ideas in economics were discredited even before they became fashionable. We knew that markets on their own are neither stable nor efficient. Economic theory had shown that. The history of 200 years of capitalism had shown that. But all that was ignored by ideology until 2008, where we once again showed what we had seen over and over and over again, that markets on their own are neither stable nor efficient. So today, in at least some circles, there's discussion of the end of neoliberalism. If you look at what has happened in the last 40 years, growth was lower, and the fruits of that growth went overwhelmingly to those at the top. The economies after neoliberalism took hold, the economies over the last 45 years have been marked by increasing inequality, increasing market power, increasing exploitation. And you can describe this in sector after sector. We have pharmaceutical companies that pushed led to the opioid crisis, which has undermined health of so many Americans. We have the childhood diabetes crisis fostered by the food companies. We have the cigarette companies pushing their addictive products, which lead to cancer and other health problems. We have the oil companies and the coal companies. Even when they had evidence, they knew that they were leading to climate change. Spent millions of dollars trying to persuade people otherwise. So the market has been actively engaged in destroying our environment. My own research focused on some of these problems in the market economy. I focused particularly in my earlier research on the problems posed by asymmetries of information. The fact that some individuals know things that others don't. I focused my research also on what happens when there are imperfect capital markets, imperfect risk markets, a host of other kinds of market imperfections, which are just ruled out by assumption in neoliberalism. Evidence over the last 40 years showed that those assumptions don't describe the modern economy. And the result of my analysis was, I put it somewhat in a pithy way by saying, the invisible hand is invisible because it's not there. Adam Smith, some 200 and almost 50 years ago, put forward the idea that the markets leads as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. But we saw in 2008 that the invisible hand, the pursuit of self-interest, greed by the financial sector did not lead to well-being of society. It led to a global financial crisis. And my research had shown that that was not a surprise, that there were systematic forces in a market economy that led to these very destructive outcomes. At the same time, my research argued that market could play, needed to play an important role. But what we needed was a better balance between the market, state, and civil society, with a richer ecology of institutional arrangements. For instance, we needed institutional arrangements, including cooperatives, the only part of our financial system that worked well in the run-up to the financial crisis of 2008 and aftermath were our cooperatives, the credit unions, which did not engage in exploitation in the way that our big banks did. In COVID-19, we turned to government. As we turn to government inevitably in times of crisis, we rely on government for public investment, for basic research that I referred to earlier, for infrastructure, as reflected in the bill that just got passed by the US Congress. And we also rely on government for regulation, for preventing the aggregation of market power, for preventing the kinds of exploitation that I described a few minutes ago, for rely on government for regulations to prevent the pollution that is destroying our planet. So markets can play an important role, and in a large economy, they have to play an important role. But there needs to be a balance between the market and the state. But unfortunately, government often fails, and it can get captured. It can be captured by special interests. And so that brings a part of the agenda that has been at the forefront for actually the last quarter century, the need for good institutions and strong democracies. But unfortunately, what that entails is one of the hardest issues going forward. And I'll come back and talk about that in a few minutes. The responses to COVID-19 illustrate both the successes and the failures. It was, as I said before, a triumph of science, discovering the vaccine in record time. It was a triumph of economic organization, a combination of government and the market producing and delivering billions of doses. It was a triumph of economic theory and policy. Government intervention prevented misery and economic disaster. Never before had there been a plummet in economic activity. But with government intervention, what would have been arguably worse than the Great Depression was forestalled. And in the United States, the decline in GDP was only 3%. So those are among the big successes that COVID-19 illustrate. But there were also some dramatic failures. The failure to produce enough doses to protect the world. As I said before, if the world can't get cooperation on something of such vital self-interest for all, when the consequences are so obvious and so immediate, how can we expect to get cooperation on more difficult issues? We also saw the inability of the emerging markets in developing countries to take adequate actions to protect their economy. They just didn't have the resources. But here, there was actually some progress, the $650 billion issuance of SDRs. But, you know, it's two steps forward, one step back. We have not yet succeeded in making sure that as much of that money can be used to address the problems of the emerging markets in developing countries, as should have been the case. And we still have an inability to deal with the looming debt problem that will be facing some, perhaps many, of the emerging markets in developing countries around the world. So in conclusion, the challenge we face today the challenge developing countries and emerging markets face today is, in light of these dramatic changes in the structure of the economy, in geopolitics, and in economic thinking, how do we create a more progressive and pragmatic economy? In many ways, we have to admit that we are less confident today that we know the right answers. We have discovered, for instance, that American institutions are more fragile, more flawed than we realized. We've recognized the importance of norms of behavior, norms that were badly broken by Trump and by so many in the Republican Party. We've recognized the multiple ways, too, that society creates an unlevel playing field, making it all the more imperative that we try to create a more equal society. As I commented a minute ago, in a large and complicated society, we will have to rely on decentralization, and that means we will have to rely on markets, but they will have to be well regulated. And there is need for competition, including from public entities. In my most recent book, People, Power, and Profits, I talk about the importance of the public option, which can enhance the offerings on the market and enhance competition and lower prices as an alternative approach by which a government can affect the well-being of our society. Underlying all of what we are doing, we have to remember that markets are not an end in themselves, but a means to an end. And the end, of course, is a more inclusive, equitable, dynamic, and sustainable society. With that, let me open up the discussion to questions, and I thank you again for inviting me.
Professor Stieglitz, I hope you see me and hear me. Thank you very much for this wide-ranging and indeed, I would say, alarming picture of the global economy. But I'd like to invite a few of our guests here, and then I'll move to a group of other distinguished panelists, or rather questioners. So let me ask first Mr. Maher al-Masri, who is former Minister of Economy and currently, of course, member of the board. Where is the mic? Sorry. So you can feel free to ask your question in English or Arabic. In case any of the questions come to you, Professor, in Arabic, you might want to toggle your interpretation, but I think we'll see as they come.
I have it on English.
Fine, okay, so you should get it in English. Tafadhal.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for your valuable speech. My name is Maher Masri. I was the Minister of Economy and Trade when you visited Palestine in '97. It's good to see you again. You really look good, and you are good to see you. Well, I'll go straight into the issue, which is, I will start from the issue of globalization and the move away of the world from globalization and the impact of that on countries or blocks of countries, where each country or blocks of countries start to really move alone, work on their own self-interest, and forget about, or at least have less interest in the rest of the world. And my interest here is to look at our case here in Palestine. How would we stand really in that new era of the phasing away of globalization and moving away from neoliberalism, ending up, in my opinion, as a separate, segregated country, which is its predicament is not that it is a developing country, but it's also under occupation. And maybe there are other spots in the world like us who will be suffering from such a phenomena of less globalization and less cooperation and less aid coming in technically and in all forms of support. To me, it looks like as if we are entering into a new dismal era, worse than where we are today, and maybe countries of our nature will suffer more and be sort of on the sideline, neglected by the world. And what would that be, the impact of this on the political situation, not only in Palestine, but also in the entire region, facing such a dismal future? I would like to see your opinion and hear your opinion on that. Thank you.
شكرا كثير أبو حامد. داود تحب تتفضل بالميكروفون. This is Mr. Dawood Deek, Deputy Minister of Social Development, no less concerned about the economy than he is. تفضل.
Thank you. In fact, you ended your presentation with saying that we are looking forward inclusive, equitable, dynamic and sustainable society. I think this is very important, but my question, how can we reach this society while all the economic problems you have been presenting are not inclusive, they are not equitable, and the big concern even after COVID-19 and following what you have presented and your expectations, I think we will face more inequality and lack of social justice. So how come we are talking about this inclusive and equitable society? Thank you.
Shukran. Thank you very much. Zain, I thought you wanted to say something. Zain Abu Daqqa, a younger economist, but working in the field, let's say. Tfaddal.
Thank you very much for your insightful lecture, Professor. My question was more related to the role of the state. So a lot of the insights that you mentioned implied that in the future we would need a stronger state, a more effective state. In the context of Palestine, for many reasons, the role of the state is in many cases absent. What options do we leave at our disposal as a people, as individuals, also as other kind of groupings, you know, unions, companies, and so on? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Would you like to take those first three, Professor, and then I have a few online questions.
Sure. Let me first, I should have emphasized perhaps more the positive side of what is going on. As the service sector becomes more important, countries are going to be more reliant on themselves. Services are less tradable than manufactured goods. So one of the interesting things that's going on globally is that trade as a fraction of global GDP is going down. And some people have lamented that as saying that's an anti-globalization move. What I want to emphasize is it's really a reflection of the change in the structure of production in the global economy, that there is less trade in services. Very naturally, services are more local in nature. And as more and more economies become a service-based economy, that means that one can become a little bit more self-reliant than would otherwise be the case. But the other part I want to emphasize, I should have emphasized more, is that small countries cannot be autarkic. No small country can be self-reliant. That one has to import and export. It's just, the degree to which that's true may differ from one country to another, but no small country can be isolated. The third thing I want to emphasize is that we often talk about there are many aspects of globalization. And one of the most important aspects of globalization is the globalization of knowledge. We are benefiting from the globalization of knowledge. I mentioned about the advances from science, the advances from the vaccine. The vaccines eventually, my complaint has been the speed, but eventually the vaccines will be available everywhere. It's just happening too slowly. So that's why it's important for countries to be open. And one of my criticisms of Trump, one of my criticisms of China under President Xi is the risk that these countries will become more isolated, less open. And so I think that it's important for Palestine, for every country, to engage to the extent that they can with the rest of the world, particularly in the area of education and knowledge. Now, I have to say that I am, as you gathered from my remarks, very worried about how the changes in the economy that are going on will affect many those countries that remain less developed, remain middle income countries. That the development model that was so successful is not going to be able to be the basis of economic growth, and we don't have a large number of examples of countries that have been successful outside of the East Asia model. And so that is going to be a real part of the challenge going forward. The particular challenge in the Middle East is going to be that a major source of income in the Middle East has been oil and gas. And the reality is that by 2050, it's hard for me to see that as a viable basis of income. It's not just the Middle East that's going to have a problem. Russia has not been, if you look at its export earnings, they are disproportionately from oil and gas. So what worries me is that over the next 30 years, the world will be facing some tectonic changes, political changes, as a result of these very large economic changes. And the point of my talk was not to give the answers, but at least to say we need to be change our mindset to face up to these challenges that we will have to face with a high probability. We can never be sure, but with a high probability. The evidence on climate change is just so overwhelming that the likelihood that we will retreat from the positions taken is very low. The greater likelihood is that we will accelerate the pace of moving away from fossil fuels. And so the real risk is that this region, those countries that are dependent on fossil fuels, will face a day of reckoning faster than what I talked about, focusing on 2150. One of the implications of what I've just said is that countries with the retreat from globalization that I described will have to become more self-reliant. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. There's the famous example of the natural resource curse. Countries that are lucky to have a large endowment of natural resources, on average, have not grown as fast as countries that don't have those natural resources. There have been a number of studies which suggest that foreign aid has many of the properties of natural resources, that countries that are more dependent on foreign assistance show many of the characteristics of countries that are excessively dependent on natural resources. So I think that focusing on what one can do in a more self-reliant way may be an important part of the strategy. This brings me to the final question, which I thought was a really good one, and I want to emphasize, again, I should have talked about this more broadly. When I talk about the role of the state, what I'm really emphasizing here is collective action. And that collective action can take on many forms. It can take the form of unions. It can take the form of NGOs. It can take the form of think tanks. It's a broad engagement with civil society, and that there are countries like Bangladesh where the state has not been a very effective institution, but where the NGOs have played a central role in promoting development and have succeeded in increasing substantially longevity, promoting economic growth. So there aren't many examples, but Bangladesh is one where one has succeeded in getting successful development with a broader range of collective action, even in the presence of what many people would consider a failed state.
Great. Let me take some of our colleagues who are graciously with us. First, I'm happy to welcome, in fact, the inaugural Yusuf صايغ lecturer, Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, who, of course, you worked with in the UN Stiglitz Commission. Jomo, go ahead and give us the view from Malaysia.
Shukran, Habibi. Assalamu alaikum. Greetings to all. And it's very good to see Professor Stiglitz in fine form and fine health. Allow me to make a couple of comments, taking off from the first commentator from the floor earlier. I think we have a very unusual situation in Palestine in that you have to deal with the settler colonial state. And this has unique implications in some ways. Yes, what does it mean to develop an economy under occupation? What does it mean to deal with a Bantustan economy? It's a strange Bantustan, not South African, Southern African-like, but rather almost in a sense of reversal, where you have a lot of occupying some of the better land available. And then the third element, which I think is very important and challenging, is the whole question of dealing with apartheid. Vaccine apartheid has become something which has attracted attention recently, but there are other peculiarities of the Palestinian economy which relate to this question. I think Professor Stiglitz challenged us to think pragmatically going forward. And this is a very important challenge. But I'm trying to grapple with the whole question of the possibilities of solar energy. Would it be possible for example, Palestine to generate a great deal of solar energy to be sold not only to Israel, but also to other parts, to neighboring economies, for instance. The costs of transmission are low. Solar energy is very, very competitive now, except when fossil fuel prices are extraordinarily low, which is certainly not the case right now. Another very important element, I think, for us to consider is that the Palestinian people have developed the highest level of human resources in the Arab world. And this is obviously something to be built upon. But it's very difficult to sustain the fiscal basis for a Palestinian state. We know, for example, from Kerala in southwestern India, that the very highly educated people of Kerala do not find work in Kerala. They find work elsewhere in India and often abroad. And the result is that the Kerala state government is unable to sustain itself in very important ways, although it does a very good job in terms of social spending, because it does not have a strong and sound fiscal basis. The third element, which I think Professor Stieglitz reminded us of, is the new Cold War. Cold Wars are very double-edged, as we know from the last Cold War. It was the Soviet Union's challenge to President Jimmy Carter, which led to the eradication of smallpox within a decade. And we can see how such a situation may well be in the interest of developing countries in general, and the Palestinian economy in particular. But I think we need to think very, very seriously about what that means. We have seen, for example, intrusions where Ramallah, for example, the computers in Ramallah, which were the basis for the Palestinian statistics in the early years, were basically confiscated and destroyed. So how do we ensure resilience in these very challenging times? Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jamal. Nice to see you as well. We also have a professor, a senior researcher at Mass, a visiting researcher who's visiting now from Copenhagen, Professor Nouman Kanafani. I hope you can connect, Nouman. Yeah, there you are. So let's see your face, see you if you could be kind enough to. Faddal, Nouman. Open your camera if you don't mind.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for these enlightening ideas. Really, you have given us a lot of food for thought. I have a single question connected to one of the 4 challenges you have mentioned, and that is the environmental issue. In the debate regarding the environment, one can feel that there is a strong divide between rich and poor countries. The poor countries insist that the environmental degradation is a result of the rich countries, while now the rich countries, they insist in their turn that more or less that we should have all the unified rules for saving the world. This divide was very clear in the recent COP26 conference in Glasgow, where the issues of shall we phase out the use of coal or phase down? So my question is, how such divide can be narrowed down in order to save our world? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nouman. And we will add to this online participation. I hope he's there also. In fact, the co-author of the 1997 study that we talked about, Dr. Radwan Shaban. Are you with us, Radwan, from East Coast, I believe? Hayat Radwan. Ahlan. He was also the first director of research at Mass. Faddal, Radwan, go ahead. Your mic, I think, is it on?
Yeah. Thank you, Raja. And it's good to see you again, Professor Stieglitz. I think when we had you at Mass 25 years, it's also good to see many of the friends over the years. When we had you over 25 years ago, we certainly, the hope was next time you would be lecturing at Mass, it would be a different political structure. I mean, it would be an independent country, would have a better performing economy, and with more freedoms to act. What I like to sort of tie the last 2 points that you presented in the lecture, the global allocation of SDRs. Because Palestine has not been independent, unfortunately, the amount of SDRs that from the 650 billion global allocation, the amount of that has been allocated to Palestine is exactly zero. Because it's not a member of the IMF, it's not an independent country as a member of the United Nations. So this is a particular benefit that has not been there. Now, you mentioned quickly the looming debt crisis and the inability to deal with that. And I would like to ask you to elaborate a bit more on that. Because what we have seen over the past couple of years is advanced countries have been able to basically open the faucet on the monetary and fiscal policy. They've been, and you talked about the rise in the debt in advanced countries, which limits their willingness or ability to aid developing countries. But at the same time, developing countries have not been able to carry out policies that would support the economy. So we're going to see a larger growth impact and greater scarring among developing countries. Yet, as we look into the coming few years, we're going to see advanced economies tightening the monetary policies, rising interest rate, tighter financial conditions. And this is likely to be hurting the developing countries quite significantly. So a question, I mean, it's sort of, I'd like you to elaborate on what, do you see a global debt crisis coming up in the coming few years in this context with relatively more depressed economic outcomes in developing countries, greater scarring, yet inability to deal with the tighter financial conditions. So I just wonder, how do you see this evolving over the next 5 to 10 years? What can developing countries do now? And what is the likely prospect for proper global cooperation on mitigating and containing this potential debt crisis? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Radwan. Well, Professor, you see, you've opened up so many questions and we're throwing them at you hard and fast. In fact, the online audience also have questions about regulation of markets, about what form the new models of economic development might take, the role of the state, even I think, which is an interesting question, perhaps the premature declaration of the demise of neoliberal markets, which are functioning quite well, I would have thought. So let's take what you have, what you've heard, if you don't mind, and if we have a few more minutes, we'll come back to the hall.
Okay, thank you very much. They're great questions, and I'll only be able to touch on them briefly. Let me go in reverse order. I am, quite frankly, pessimistic about the ability of the advanced countries to, of the ability of the global market, to deal with a debt crisis. The problem of debt is more complicated today than it was, say, 20 years ago, because there is now not just bank debt, but private debt. There is Chinese debt. China has not shown a willingness to restructure debt. In the beginning of COVID-19, there was an attempt to organize a debt stay, and which was just a very limited, not a restructuring the debt, but just say you don't have to service your debt while the COVID-19 is having its devastating effects. And we couldn't even get agreement on that. So my view is that the prospects of the kind of deep and timely restructuring of the debt that is needed is not, that's not likely to happen. And I think your comment was exactly right. Interest rates with a high probability will rise somewhat. How much we don't know, but they will rise. And that will make the management of the debt all the more difficult. So I don't think it's necessarily going to be a global financial crisis, but it will have devastating effects on the particular countries that are facing these debt crises, countries like Zambia, possibly Argentina. And it will have a very difficult effect on the regions in which these countries are located. The point that you made about Palestine getting zero SDRs is a important observation. I mentioned in my remarks that there was the hope that those countries that, the advanced countries that don't need all their SDRs could contribute their SDRs to a fund that would, we say, recycle the SDRs. And those funds could be lent to Palestine. They wouldn't have to they wouldn't have to take the same form as the SDRs. And in some places, the SDRs go into the central bank, and what the government is going to do is the Treasury will take an offsetting measure in foreign aid to balance the increase in the balance sheet of the government from the SDRs that are coming in. So I think if there were a willingness for the international community to act, it could. The question is there going to be that kind of willingness? And, some of us are working very hard to make sure that happens. It's a moral issue. I think it's an issue having to do with the stability of the global landscape. I think the consequences of not doing it can be very severe, but it's not going to be easy. And that brings me to the second question, the environment. We just had this meeting in Glasgow. Everybody recognized, science makes it very clear about the dangers. And in the face of all that, there was insufficient action. You mentioned they were going to, rather than ending coal, they're going to move it down. Everybody knew that was going to happen. You didn't have to have a meeting with thousands of people meeting in Glasgow. It was clear that coal is on the way out. The developed countries have made a promise to provide $100 billion to the developing countries to help them finance. They couldn't even come up with that. They say eventually we will in the next few years come up with $100 billion. But $100 billion is not what is needed. What is needed is 3 times that. Now, one of the things I've been advocating is an annual issuance of $200-300 billion for climate change, and issued for the emerging markets in developing countries that have it, including some of the facilities that I described that would make it available to Palestine. This is only one part of what has to be done, but when the international community needs to recognize that unless the emerging markets and developing countries are brought on board in reducing emissions, we are not going to limit climate change to 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade. We're going to be talking about 3 to 4 degrees centigrade. So the idea Europe, by United States, by saying that they're going to go to net neutrality by 2050 is solving the problem is a fantasy. Yes, it's important for them to go to zero, but it's important for the rest of the world to get to zero relatively quickly. And that won't happen without more financial assistance and of a much larger magnitude than has been talked about so far. So I hope that this realization will eventually set in. I know I've been in conversations where at least some people are aware that it is actually essential and that $100 billion is not enough. It has to be 3-4 times that magnitude. There also have to be changes in intellectual property rights, that the original Rio Agreement provided for compulsory licenses associated with meeting climate goals. But that important provision has been largely ignored by the developed countries. And so I think there needs to be real efforts to transfer technology that will enhance the ability of developing countries and emerging markets to meet these climate change goals. It's in the interest of the entire world. And I only hope that they realize it soon enough. Now, that brings me to the first question, which is one of the areas that Palestine can contribute is precisely in developing renewable energy. You have an endowment of sun, and one ought to use that. And particularly if you think about there being, what are the two of the key resources? It was energy and human resources, human capital. And bringing together energy and human capital may give Palestine some areas of comparative advantage. The example of Kerala was actually a very apt example, because what they didn't do was industrial policy. They did education well. They did health well, but they didn't create a job market. They didn't create they did in some areas like tourism, but they didn't create a broader sense of economic activity. And so, unfortunately, a very large fraction of their educated population would go and work somewhere else, elsewhere in the Middle East. And so it's important, and this is why I emphasized in my talk, the new thinking about industrial policy. Now, you hinted in your comments as you invited me to speak that somebody raised the question, is it really the end of neoliberalism? Well, obviously, this is a battle of ideas that is going on. But as one example of that, there was both agreements on Democrats and Republicans. Both sides of the political stance in the United States is that we need industrial policy in the United States. And there is a wide recognition all over the world that you need industrial policies to promote, to move us towards for the green transition, to address the problems of inequality. And the problems that we've seen, lower growth that I mentioned in the beginning, lower growth, more inequality, rampant exploitation, and especially of the poor, have shown that neoliberalism has failed. And so while obviously some people have done very well, the people in the top 0.1%, and so they will argue to the contrary, I think there is an increasing fraction, at least in our democracy, if you ask specific questions like, should you double the minimum wage? Should you have strong regulation of banks? Should government ensure that everybody has access to health and education and a secure retirement? There's a broad consensus. So I would say we are moving towards a post-neoliberal world, but exactly, we know what we need to do. Exactly how to do that remains an important question.
Thank you very, very much. I'm not going to burden you with any more questions, though I'm sure there are many other issues that might have come up. However, you have given us, at least me, an interesting hook for perhaps the next lecture, namely the new thinking about industrial policy, or is it the end of industrial policy? Maybe it's time for us to ask Ha-Joon Chang that question. But allow me to exploit my position with one question I thought would come up. Should we consider transitional inflation a thing of the past? The idea that this inflationary wave is transitional, is that no longer the case in your view?
Well, we are facing this slight increase in prices as we move out of COVID-19, faster in the United States than in most of Europe and in many other places. Much of that inflation can be related to energy prices. The price of oil has increased from a very low level to back to where it was about 5 years ago. It's not going to continue to go up. It may go up a little bit, but as I said, the long run, it's going to come down again. Food, yes, there are scarcities. Again, we've had a lot of supply chain interruptions, and we've never been through an experiment like we've done of shutting down the economy and then trying to restart it. And what we discovered, that the underlying economic model, just-in-time production, was not a good model, especially when you have a big interruption. We saw that our supply chains were not resilient. So we are facing some problems that we should have anticipated. The car manufacturers, when they canceled their chip orders, should have thought, well, in a year, we're going to restart it. Let's order now for a year ahead of time. But that's not what they did. And so now they're facing a shortage of chips. And the result of that is car prices are going up. Used car prices are going up. So you can see in all the areas where most of the inflation is occurring are particular disturbances. What we don't know is the extent to which it will get built into inflationary expectations and perpetuate. But unions are weak. Evidence so far is that it's not being built into inflationary expectations. But anybody who thinks that they can forecast something that we've never been through before is foolish. So my best bet with most of the central bankers around the world is that it's transitory, and we will work our way through it. But it's nice being present as we are living history, and it'll give a lot of the younger people a lot of things to write about as they do research in the future.
Professor Joseph Stieglitz, thank you very much again for honoring us and for sharing your thoughts, and for that little last piece of advice. We'll hold on, hope for the inflation to subside and the dollar to strengthen. Thank you very much, sir, and we hope that you can visit us next time.
Thank you.
وتفضلوا على عشاء خفيف. شكر خاص موصول للطاقم الفني اليوم والإداري. لا يعني بجد يعني الحمد لله، شكرا كثير، شكرا. والمترجمة رانيا الله يعطيك.
Thank you.